Clara's arms ached as she trudged down the narrow sidewalk, balancing a paper bag of groceries in one hand and a crumpled stack of overdue bills in the other. She sighed, shifting the bag to her hip as the wind tugged at her thin jacket. It was mid-October, and the small town of Willow Creek was painted in shades of amber and crimson. The air was crisp, and the streets bustled with people going about their day. But Clara wasn't admiring the fall colors. She was focused on stretching every dollar just to make it through the week. As she turned the corner near the town square, her eyes caught a frail elderly man struggling with several overstuffed shopping bags. His face was red from exertion, and his hands trembled under the weight of the packages. He paused to set the bags down on the edge of the curb, breathing heavily. Clara hesitated for a moment. She was already late to pick up her son from school, and the groceries were digging uncomfortably into her side. But seeing the man glance around helplessly, she couldn't just walk by. "Do you need a hand?" she called out, stepping closer. The man looked up, startled, and then smiled faintly. "Oh, bless you, dear. I thought I could manage, but these old bones aren't what they used to be." Clara placed her grocery bag on the sidewalk and bent down to lift two of his bags. They were heavier than she expected, filled with cans and other supplies. "Where are you headed?" "Just a few blocks down," he said, motioning toward a quieter residential street. "I didn't think the walk back from the market would be this hard. My name's Donnelly, by the way. Arthur Donnelly." "Clara?" she replied with a small smile. "Let's get you home." As they walked, Arthur chatted warmly, though he paused often to catch his breath. He mentioned that he had lived in Willow Creek for decades and that his wife had passed away 5 years ago. "It's just me now," he said with a wistful tone. "No children, no close family left. I get by, but days like this remind me I'm not as young as I used to be." Clara nodded, adjusting her grip on the bags. "I know what it's like to need a hand," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Arthur glanced at her curiously, but didn't press further. Instead, he smiled and said, "Not many people stop to help these days. You're a good soul, Clara." They reached his home, a modest red brick house with a neatly trimmed lawn and a faded white door. Clara noticed how tidy the place was, though it had an air of quiet loneliness about it. She set the bags down on his porch and wiped her hands on her jeans. "Thank you, my dear," Arthur said, pulling out a key and unlocking the door. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? It's the least I can do." Clara shook her head politely. "I'd love to, but I'm running late to pick up my son. Maybe another time." Arthur nodded, though he looked a little disappointed. "Well, the offer stands, and if you're ever in the neighborhood, stop by. I'd like to repay your kindness." Clara smiled, already stepping back toward the sidewalk. "Take care, Mr. Donnelly." As she walked away, Arthur stood by his door, watching her with a thoughtful expression. Clara didn't give the encounter much thought as she hurried to pick up her 8-year-old son, Danny, from school. Her life was too full of worries: unpaid rent, mounting medical bills from Danny's asthma treatments, and her part-time job at the diner barely keeping them afloat. Helping an elderly man with his groceries didn't seem like a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But as she tucked Danny into bed that night and sat at the kitchen table to sort through her bills, her thoughts drifted back to Arthur. There had been something about his quiet dignity, his gratitude, that stuck with her. She didn't know it yet, but that small moment of kindness would soon change her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. A week had passed since Clara helped Mr. Donnelly with his groceries, and life hadn't slowed down for her one bit. Between her long shifts, at the diner and Danny's school needs, her days felt like an endless cycle of rushing and worrying. The encounter with the elderly man had faded into the background of her thoughts, another small moment in a life packed with responsibilities. It was a Saturday afternoon when Clara found herself back at the local grocery store, clutching a short shopping list and trying to calculate how to stretch her budget. The aisles were crowded, and Danny tugged at her hand, pointing out colorful cereal boxes and snacks she couldn't afford. "Not today, sweetheart," she said gently, patting his head. "We're just getting what we need." As she turned the corner into the produce section, a familiar figure caught her eye. Mr. Donnelly was there, leaning heavily on his cart as he tried to maneuver it toward the checkout line. His cart was packed high again, and his frail frame struggled to push the weight. Clara hesitated for a moment, glancing at Danny, who was now eyeing a display of apples. "Stay right here, okay, Danny?" she said, giving him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before walking toward Mr. Donnelly. "Mr. Donnelly?" she called out. His head turned and his face lit up with recognition. "Well, if it isn't my good Samaritan," he said, smiling warmly. "Clara, wasn't it?" "That's right," she said, stepping beside him. "Looks like you've got your hands full again." He chuckled, though his breathing was slightly labored. "What can I say? Old habits die hard. I still shop like I'm cooking for two, even though it's just me these days." "Here, let me help," Clara said, taking hold of the cart handle. "Where's your car?" "I walked again," he admitted sheepishly. "Didn't think it would be this much of a haul." Clara shook her head with a small laugh. "You're going to wear yourself out, Mr. Donnelly. Come on, let's get you checked out, and I'll give you a ride home." He looked at her with gratitude, but also a hint of hesitation. "You've already done so much for me, Clara. I don't want to impose." "It's no trouble," she said firmly. "Besides, I've got my car today, and I think Danny would love to meet you." At the mention of her son, Mr. Donnelly's expression softened. "Well, if you're sure." "I'm sure," she said, wheeling the cart toward the checkout line. After Mr. Donnelly's groceries were bagged and loaded into Clara's small, slightly dented sedan, she introduced Danny, who shyly waved from the back seat. "Hello there, young man," Mr. Donnelly said with a warm smile. "You must be Danny. Your mom's been my saving grace these past few weeks." Danny grinned, his initial shyness melting away. "Mom helps everyone," he said proudly. Clara laughed, though she felt a pang of guilt. She wished she could do more to help herself and Danny, but it seemed like there was never enough time or money to fix everything. When they arrived at Mr. Donnelly's house, Clara helped him carry the bags inside. She was about to leave when he gestured toward the backyard. "Wait a moment," he said. "I'd like to show you something." Clara hesitated, glancing at her watch. Danny was happily munching on an apple Mr. Donnelly had handed him, and for once, they weren't in a rush. "All right," she said, following him through the kitchen and out the back door. The backyard was a picture of serenity. A tall apple tree stood in the middle, its branches heavy with fruit, and an old wooden bench rested beneath it. The grass was neatly trimmed, and a small vegetable garden lined one side of the yard. Clara felt a sense of calm wash over her, a stark contrast to the chaos of her daily life. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mr. Donnelly said, watching her reaction. "My wife and I planted that tree decades ago. It's outlived her, but it keeps giving, year after year." "It's lovely," Clara said, her voice soft. She hadn't felt this peaceful in a long time. "Why don't you take some apples home with you?" he offered. "They're ripe and ready, and I can't possibly eat them all." "Oh no, I couldn't," Clara said, shaking her head. "You've already been so kind." "Nonsense," he said with a wave of his hand. "You've done more for me than you realize. Consider this a small thank you." After a moment's hesitation, Clara nodded. "Okay, but only if Danny helps me pick them." Mr. Donnelly laughed, and Danny's eyes lit up. "Yes," the boy exclaimed, running over to the tree. As Danny climbed onto the bench to reach the lower branches, Clara and Mr. Donnelly sat down together, watching him. "You've got a good boy there," Mr. Donnelly said. "He reminds me of myself, at that age. full of energy and wonder. "Thank you," Clara said, smiling. "He's my whole world." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Mr. Donnelly spoke again. "Life has a funny way of testing us," he said, his voice quieter now. Clara nodded, looking down at her hands. "Sometimes it feels like it's all one big test," she admitted. He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "And how are you holding up, Clara? Really?" She hesitated, unsure how much to share. "It's tough," she said finally. "But I'm managing. I have to, for Danny." Mr. Donnelly nodded, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. "And what about you? Your dreams? Your goals?" Clara let out a small laugh, though it lacked humor. "Dreams feel like a luxury these days. Between work and bills and making sure Danny's okay, there's not much room for anything else." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You know, sometimes the right opportunities come when we least expect them. You never know what might be just around the corner." Clara didn't respond, but his words stayed with her as they filled a small basket with apples and said their goodbyes. She didn't know why, but something about Mr. Donnelly's quiet wisdom and generosity gave her a sliver of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself stopping by Mr. Donnelly's house more often. It wasn't something she'd planned. It just seemed to happen naturally. On her days off, she'd bake a small batch of muffins using whatever ingredients she could spare from the diner and bring them over. In return, Mr. Donnelly would insist she take a bag of fresh vegetables or a jar of homemade jam. Their visits became a quiet rhythm, a small reprieve from the stress that weighed on Clara's shoulders. Danny had taken a liking to Mr. Donnelly, as well, and he often came along, running through the backyard or peppering the older man with questions about his life. Mr. Donnelly answered each one with patience and humor, his eyes twinkling as he shared stories about his younger days. One crisp November afternoon, Clara arrived at Mr. Donnelly's house with a loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil. Danny was at a friend's house, so it was just her this time. She knocked lightly on the door, and when Mr. Donnelly opened it, he greeted her with his usual warm smile. "Ah, Clara," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "You're spoiling me again, I see." "Just a little something," she said, handing him the loaf. "I had some overripe bananas, and I figured I'd put them to good use." He chuckled. "Well, come on in. I was just making myself a cup of tea." Clara followed him into the kitchen, where the kettle was already whistling. As he poured the tea and gestured for her to sit at the table, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw it was her landlord. Her stomach tightened. She'd been avoiding his calls for days, knowing she didn't have the full rent yet. She hesitated, then sighed and answered. "Hi, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice tight. "Clara," the gruff voice on the other end replied. "I hate to do this, but it's been 2 months now. I need that payment by the end of next week, or I'll have no choice but to move forward with eviction." Clara's face burned with shame, and she turned slightly away from Mr. Donnelly, hoping he wouldn't overhear. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll figure something out." "See that you do," Mr. Hargrove said before hanging up. Clara lowered the phone slowly, staring at the table as her heart pounded. "Everything all right?" Mr. Donnelly's voice was gentle, but she could hear the concern in it. She forced a smile and turned back to him. "Oh, it's nothing. Just some bills I need to sort out." He didn't press her immediately, but as they sipped their tea, he studied her carefully. "Clara," he said after a long pause, "you've been so kind to me these past few weeks. I'd like to think we're friends now, and friends don't have to carry their burdens alone." Her hands tightened around her teacup. "It's really nothing," she said, her voice faltering. "I'll manage." "You're a proud one, aren't you?" he said, smiling softly. "I can respect that, but there's no shame in asking for help when you need it." Clara hesitated, staring into the tea as if it held the answers. Finally, she let out a trembling sigh. "I'm behind on rent," she admitted. "It's been hard to keep up with everything. Danny's medical bills, groceries, school supplies. I'm doing my best, but it never feels like enough." Mr. Donnelly nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's a heavy load to carry," he said. "But you're doing it, Clara. You're doing it for your son, and that says everything about the kind of person you are." She blinked back tears, embarrassed but also touched by his words. "Thank you," she murmured. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "Tell me something," he said after a moment. "What did you want to do before life got so complicated? What were your dreams?" Clara let out a small, bittersweet laugh. "Dreams feel like a luxury these days," she said. "Humor me," he said, smiling. She hesitated, then said, "I wanted to be an accountant. Numbers always made sense to me, even when life didn't. I started taking classes at the community college, but..." She trailed off, shrugging. "Things happened. My parents got sick and I had to drop out to take care of them. Then I had Danny and, well, life just kind of took over." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the right opportunities come when we least expect them," he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly, but she didn't respond. She didn't dare hope for anything more than what she had now. Later that evening, after Clara had left, Mr. Donnelly sat at his desk in his small home office. The room was lined with shelves of books and framed photographs, many of them featuring a younger version of himself alongside his late wife. On his desk sat several awards from his business days, now collecting dust. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old address book, flipping through its worn pages until he found the name he was looking for. Picking up the phone, he dialed the number and leaned back in his chair as it rang. "Hello?" a familiar voice answered. "James," Mr. Donnelly said, smiling. "It's Arthur Donnelly. It's been a while." "Arthur, my goodness, it has been," the man replied warmly. "How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. And you?" "Can't complain. Still running the firm, keeping busy." "That's actually why I'm calling," Mr. Donnelly said. "I was wondering if you might have an opening for a junior accountant, someone sharp, hardworking, and in need of an opportunity." James chuckled. "You've always had an eye for talent, Arthur. Send them my way, and I'll see what I can do." "Thank you," Mr. Donnelly said. "I'll be in touch soon." 2 days later, Clara received an unexpected phone call. The man on the other end introduced himself as James Whitaker, the owner of an accounting firm in a nearby town. "Arthur Donnelly told me about you," he said. "He speaks very highly of you, and I trust his judgment. We're looking for a junior accountant, and I'd like to offer you the position. It's part-time to start, but there's room to grow." Clara was stunned, her hand trembling as she held the phone. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," James said with a chuckle. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, thank you so much." That same afternoon, a letter arrived in her mailbox. Inside was a check for $8,000 and a handwritten note. "To help you get started on your new chapter. From Arthur." Clara sat at her kitchen table, staring at the check and the note through a blur of tears. She couldn't fathom such generosity, but one thing was certain: her life was about to change. Clara sat at her kitchen table long after Danny had gone to bed, the check and Mr. Donnelly's note still in front of her. She traced the edges of the paper with her fingertips, her emotions a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and a deep sense of humility. She had no idea that Mr. Donnelly, the kind but unassuming man who lived alone, would do something so monumental for her and Danny. The next morning, Clara made up her mind. She couldn't let such an act of generosity go without a proper thank you, She woke early, baked a fresh batch of Danny's favorite chocolate chip muffins, and packed them carefully into a tin. With Danny at her side, they walked to Mr. Donnelly's house under a sky streaked with winter's pale sunlight. When Mr. Donnelly opened the door, his face broke into a warm smile. "Clara, Danny, what a surprise." "We had to come," Clara said, holding up the tin of muffins. "I couldn't just say thank you over the phone. I needed to tell you in person how much this means to us." "Well, come in," he said, stepping aside and waving them into the cozy warmth of his home. Clara had been here several times before, but she hadn't spent much time in Mr. Donnelly's living room. Now, as she set the tin of muffins on the coffee table, she took a moment to look around. The room was small but inviting, with soft, worn furniture and bookshelves filled to the brim. Framed photos lined the mantel above the fireplace. Pictures of Mr. Donnelly and a smiling woman Clara assumed was his late wife. There were also small knickknacks: a delicate porcelain bird, a hand-carved wooden box, and a glass jar filled with smooth beach stones. Danny immediately gravitated toward the bookshelf, his fingers tracing the spines of the books. Mr. Donnelly chuckled. "Go ahead, young man. Pick one out if you'd like." As Danny immersed himself in his discovery, Clara turned to Mr. Donnelly, who was settling into his favorite armchair. She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't even know where to begin," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That check, it's more than I ever could have imagined. You didn't have to do that, Mr. Donnelly." He waved a hand dismissively. "Arthur, please." "And of course I didn't have to, but I wanted to. You've been struggling, Clara, and you've been doing it with such grace and determination. If I can help lighten your load, why wouldn't I?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. "Still, it's not something I'll ever forget. You've changed our lives." Mr. Donnelly leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His expression was kind but serious. "Let me tell you something, Clara. Money only matters when it can make a difference. My wife, Evelyn, and I worked hard our whole lives. I used to run a small but successful business, and when we sold it and retired, we found we had more than we needed. But life has a way of getting away from you. Evelyn and I always talked about giving back, about helping others, but between work and the day-to-day, we never quite got around to it. And then she was gone." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Clara listened intently, her heart aching for him. "After she passed," he continued, "I realized how much time I'd wasted waiting for the right moment. It's one of my biggest regrets. But meeting you, seeing the way you care for Danny, and the way you've faced your challenges, it's given me a sense of purpose I haven't felt in years. Evelyn would have wanted this. She would have loved you and Danny." Clara's throat tightened, and she struggled to find the right words. "Arthur, I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done." He reached across the coffee table and patted her hand. "You don't need to repay me, Clara. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you'll do the same for someone else one day. When you're in a position to help, no matter how small the gesture, pay it forward. That's all I ask." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I promise. You didn't have to help me, but you did. I'll never forget that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words settling between them. Then Mr. Donnelly smiled and leaned back in his chair. "Now tell me about this new job of yours. When do you start?" Clara smiled, the corners of her mouth trembling. "Next week. I'm nervous, but I'm excited too. It's been so long since I've done anything like this, but I'm ready to try." "I have no doubt you'll do great," he said with conviction. "You're a quick learner, and you've got the drive. That's half the battle right there." As they continued to talk, Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was hope. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to embrace in a long time. She realized that Mr. Donnelly's kindness wasn't just about the money or the job opportunity. It was about the belief he had in her, the way he saw a future for her and Danny that she was only beginning to imagine for herself. When it was time to leave, Danny reluctantly put the book he'd been flipping through back on the shelf. Mr. Donnelly noticed and chuckled. "Why don't you take that one home, Danny? You can bring it back whenever you're done." "Really?" Danny asked, his eyes wide. "Really," Mr. Donnelly said with a wink. As Clara and Danny walked back home, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. She glanced down at Danny, who was clutching the book to his chest and skipping along the sidewalk. "Mom?" he said, looking up at her. "Yes, sweetheart." "Mr. Donnelly's really nice, isn't he?" "He is," Clara said, smiling. "He's one of the nicest people I've ever met." Danny nodded thoughtfully. "When I grow up, I want to be like him." Clara's heart swelled, and she reached down to ruffle his hair. "Me too, Danny. Me too." As the sun dipped lower, in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Willow Creek, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of possibility. Arthur Donnelly had given her more than a second chance. He had given her the courage to dream again. Months had passed since Clara started her new job at the accounting firm, and life had begun to shift in ways she hadn't thought possible. The transition wasn't easy. There were long nights of studying to relearn concepts she hadn't touched in years, and moments of self-doubt as she juggled her responsibilities at work and at home. But with each passing week, she grew more confident. Her boss, James Whitaker, had been patient and encouraging, and she found herself thriving under his mentorship. Financially, things had started to stabilize. Clara was finally able to pay her rent on time, chip away at Danny's medical bills, and even set aside a modest amount each month for savings. The weight that had pressed down on her for so long was lifting, replaced by a cautious optimism. Through it all, her visits with Mr. Donnelly remained a constant. Every Sunday, she and Danny would stop by his house with baked goods or small gifts, a jar of homemade jam, a bouquet of wildflowers Danny had picked, or a photo Danny had drawn of the three of them under the apple tree. It was a bright, cool afternoon when Clara parked her car in front of Mr. Donnelly's house, the trunk filled with a picnic basket and a plaid blanket. She and Danny had planned something special, a picnic in Mr. Donnelly's backyard under the apple tree. "Do you think he'll like it, Mom?" Danny asked eagerly as he hopped out of the car, clutching a tin of oatmeal cookies they'd baked together that morning. Clara smiled, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "I think he'll love it. You know how much he enjoys spending time with us." Danny grinned and bounded up the front steps, knocking on the door while Clara carried the picnic basket. When Mr. Donnelly opened the door, his face lit up in surprise. "Well, what's all this?" "We're kidnapping you for the afternoon," Clara said, with a playful smile. "You're coming outside with us for a picnic." Mr. Donnelly laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A picnic, you say? I suppose I can't say no to that." They made their way to the backyard, where the apple tree stood tall and proud, its branches bare now that winter was approaching. Clara spread the blanket beneath it, and Danny busied, himself laying out sandwiches, cookies, and a thermos of hot cocoa. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and the occasional story from Mr. Donnelly about his younger days. Danny listened intently, his eyes wide with wonder as Mr. Donnelly described the adventures he and his wife had shared during their travels. After a while, Clara leaned back against the tree trunk, her gaze drifting to the sky. "You know, Arthur, I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day, about paying it forward." He tilted his head, looking at her with curiosity. "And?" "I've started saving," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for emergencies, but for Danny's future. A college fund. It's not much yet, but it's a start." Mr. Donnelly's face softened, and he smiled. That's wonderful, Clara. He's a bright boy. I have no doubt he'll do great things. Clara looked over at Danny, who was now chasing a squirrel across the yard, giggling as it darted up the tree. Your help didn't just change my life, Arthur, she said quietly. It's going to change his life too. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? He replied, his voice warm. She turned to him, her eyes glistening. You've given us so much more than a second chance. You showed me what kindness can do. I just hope I can live up to the example you've set. Mr. Donnelly reached over and gently patted her hand. Clara, you already have. You may not realize it, but you've given me something even greater in return. Companionship and hope. These past few months, having you and Danny in my life has been a gift I never expected. You've brought light back into this old house. Clara felt her throat tighten, and she blinked back tears. You've become family to us, Arthur. I hope you know that. He smiled, his gaze drifting to Danny, who was now trying to climb the apple tree. I do, my dear. I do. As the afternoon wore on, Danny finally managed to shimmy partway up the tree, plucking a small, shriveled apple that had somehow clung to one of the higher branches. He held it up triumphantly, grinning from ear to ear. Look, Mom! Look, Mr. Donnelly! He called out. Mr. Donnelly laughed, his voice rich with delight. Well done, young man. You've got the makings of a fine apple picker. Clara laughed, her heart full as she watched Danny scramble down the tree and run toward them, holding out the apple like a prized treasure. They spent the rest of the day talking and laughing, sharing stories and dreams under the apple tree. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the backyard, Clara felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living, and she knew without a doubt that brighter days were ahead. As they packed up the picnic and prepared to leave, Mr. Donnelly stood by the back door, watching Clara and Danny with a fond smile. See you next Sunday? Clara asked as she turned to him. Wouldn't miss it, he replied, his voice warm. As Clara and Danny walked to the car, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the branches of the apple tree, she glanced back and waved. Mr. Donnelly waved back, his figure framed in the soft glow of the setting sun.